we go. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see you. It's great to have some really exciting panelists joining us today. I think Dan just texted me. He's about to hop on. My name is Brooke. I'm a state delegate representing District 46 here in Baltimore City, and I represent the 46th District along with my co-delegates, Robin Lewis and Luke Clippinger, and Senator Bill Ferguson. And of course, although we represent District 46, like all delegates, we do work across the states, and this discussion is really a statewide discussion. So it's exciting to be here with all of you today. You know, I think I'm going to talk for a little bit, quick introduction, and then we're going to jump right into our panelists, and then have some time for Q&A at the end. A number of people submitted questions. It was great questions, so excited to check those out. I think if there's one thing this pandemic has done besides cause so much unnecessary suffering and death, it's really crystallized the pre-existing disparities that existed in our society and the lack of resiliency in our communities and state government institutions to support families and small businesses and nonprofits. And I've held a series of these online briefings since coming home from the truncated General Assembly session on a variety of topics. And, you know, I think it's just so important to hold these types of webinars and briefings because being an elected official is about more than passing legislation. It's really about connecting people with the resources they need, driving discussions about important topics, and advocating for change in multiple ways, including through discussions like this one, and really making sure that we're educating ourselves about our sordid history and how it affects the present and what we can do to work in the present to build a better future. So why a webinar and briefing on zoning and redlining? Well, last year, I became the chair of the Land Use Subcommittee on the Environment and Transportation Committee. And you know what they say, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So all of a sudden, and I'm guessing my panelists will agree, everything looks like land use to me, whether it's environmental policy or transit policy, housing policy, it's now all land use to me. And so I am really so grateful to have the folks who are here today because they are policy experts. They're people that I look to for ideas, for resources, so I can educate myself to do a better job. And I'm just thrilled to have them on here today. And I think, you know, probably many of you know that residential segregation in Baltimore dates back, you know, over 100 years ago. And most people point to the decades of redlining or rating the desirability of neighborhoods as one of the greatest factors that really has fueled the increase in the economic gap and disparity between white people and African-American communities. And, you know, just generations of people of color and their families were denied homeownership and a path to wealth accumulation. In fact, today, a great study came out, and we have one of the authors on SEMA on Black homeownership in Baltimore and how the challenges really continue. A recent study showed that Black families have lost out on about $212,000 of personal wealth over the past several decades because their homes were redlined. So, you know, while redlining has been technically outlawed for decades, many of the neighborhoods that were redlined continue to struggle. And I think it's really important as a history major for all of us to understand what happened in the past and how it impacts today. And I'm about halfway through this book, which I recommend. It's fascinating, if depressing and infuriating as well. But I'm really delighted to have really phenomenal people here today. I'm going to share a little bit about them so everybody can see who we have with us today. So excited to have Garrett Knapp, the Executive Director of the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education, an economist and professor of urban studies and planning in the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. He is also the director of the Environmental Finance Center and the Transportation Policy Research Group, and is a member of the Governor's Smart Growth Subcabinet. Seema from Baltimore, many of you may know, Seema Iyer is the director of the Real Estate and Economic Development Program in the Merrick School of Business and the associate director of the Jacob Grants Institute, and she oversees the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, BINYA. I don't know, do other people call it that? That's what I call it sometimes. And is, of course, a recognized expert on strategic planning and community development. And so delighted to have Willow Lung Amam here as well. She's the Director of Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education. She's an affiliate faculty at American University's Metropolitan Policy Center and at the University of Maryland's Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity in the Department of American Studies. And she was recently she's a recent Nancy Weiss Malkiel Scholar and former Ford postdoctoral fellow. And Dan Reed, many of you may read his tweets or writings for a number of, on his blog and elsewhere. He's a writer, urban planner, and real estate agent. He's also on the board of Action Committee for Transit, an advocacy group in Montgomery County. In 2009, he graduated from College Park with a double degree in architecture and English, and he's worked for County Council member George Leventhal. In May 2012, he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with his degree in city planning and a concentration in urban design. So he's also the creator of the blog Just Up the Pike, which is a blog about design, planning, and development issues in and around Silver Spring, Maryland. But it's more than that, really, Dan. He does so much and is very familiar with so much all around Maryland. So with those introductions, I'm really excited to turn it over to our panelists. And we are going to start with you, Garrett, and we have the slides up here. So I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke, and thanks everybody for joining. It's great to be invited to this panel. Pleased to be joined with my esteemed panelists, of course, and looking through the participants, I see many friends and colleagues that we know and run around with on these land use issues. And we do think everything is land use at the Smart Growth Center, of course. I'm not going to talk about redlining, so I'm going to talk less about the past, and I'll talk more about the present. We at the National Center for Smart Growth are working with enterprise community partners on a housing needs assessment for the State Department of Housing and Community Development, and I'm going to share some of those data that we are putting together in that report. And I want to thank my colleague Nick Finio and his colleagues at Enterprise for those data that I'm going to share with you today. So next slide. So I'm going to talk about land use and zoning in the state of Maryland. And as we know, land use and zoning decisions are largely the purview of local governments in Maryland. That's true just about everywhere in the country. Maryland has a reputation for state intervention more so than most states around the country, but personally I think that's overstated in many cases. Land use is and remains largely the purview of local governments in the state. It is true that state law requires that zoning must be consistent with its land use plan. It is also true that the state reviews and comments on local plans. It provides incentives for smart growth, for which Maryland has become quite famous. Now, after a long, long battle, requires a housing element, which is kind of remarkable, actually, if you think about how many years it's taken to get the state to require a housing element when residential land makes up about 3/4 of the land in metropolitan areas.
And that was a hard-fought battle just a couple of years ago in the state.
I'm sure it was.
My first land use bill.
And it's been a long struggle. It's been on the agenda for a long time. But otherwise, local governments are largely free to zone as they please. But I will say that because of the things I've listed above here, there is a framework and some tools for leverage the state can use, I think, to shape land use policy at the local level, because it can't intervene too distinctly because it's just politically not likely to happen. So next slide, please. So I got lots of data here, and I'm not going to be able to pour through any, much of it, and you're not going to be able to consume many of these data. I presume, Brooke, you'll make these PowerPoints available later on. But
certainly. Yep.
Urban land use in Maryland is largely zoned for low density use. Perhaps this is not surprising, but even if you look at Maryland cities and you look at the distribution of commercial, industrial, mixed use, very low, medium, and high density land in the state, and you look at that bottom row, you can see that only 4.5% of land in cities in the state of Maryland is zoned for high density, and high density means more than 10 units per acre. So that's not a very high bar, right? So 13.3% of the land in urban areas and 36% is low density. So much of the land in the state of Maryland remains designated by zoning for low density use. Next. And not surprisingly, and somewhat correspondingly, if we look at the permits that are issued by counties in the state of Maryland, most of them are issued for single family housing. If you look at that row that's bracketed in red, You can see that from the 2000 to 2019, somewhere between 81 and 69 or 63% of the building permits issued in the state of Maryland are issued for single family use. It was 80% in 2000, from 2000 to 2004. It's slightly lower now, but it's hard to discern any distinct trend here. I think that was hoped for when the smart growth statutes were passed many years ago. Next. So most counties issue very few multifamily permits. If we look at the single family share of all construction in the state of Maryland, we can see that's roughly 70%. The only counties that are really exceptions in the state that do much in the way of multifamily permits, in other words, the single family share is low, are Montgomery, Howard, Baltimore City, and Baltimore counties. Just about all of the rest of them are 3/4 or more. The permits are for single family use. So this graph illustrates the loans currently in place that are underwater, so to speak, or negative equity loans. And we can see that the ones marked in red are the ones with the highest share of negative equity loans. And perhaps not surprisingly, we can see that they are highest in Baltimore City, in Prince George's County, and in Wycomico County, which not coincidentally are where most people of color live in this state. Housing prices in Maryland are among the highest in the nation. I don't have the data here that shows where Maryland ranks relative to the nation, but it's quite high. And if your eye goes to Howard and Montgomery County, these are extremely high housing prices in these counties in the state. If we look at the denial rates, or the rates at which people are refused for loans, we can see the distribution here by demographic groups. Whereas the white population, the decline rate is just over 10%. The African-American decline rate is nearly double that. Similarly high for Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and for American Indian and Native Alaskan. So the rate at which people are rejected for mortgage loans is much higher for people of color than for white residents in the state. If we look at cost burdens, this graph illustrates cost burdens. First, moderately cost burden, which is over 30% of income paid for rent or mortgages. Severely cost burden is more than 50%. And the last graph is the total population. So whereas you can see that of the total population, African Americans represent 22% of the population. They represent 28% of the severely cost burden population and 27% of the moderately cost burden. Similarly, high rates for other people of color. So what does this all mean in my 8 minutes? So low density zoning is widely recognized as a cause of housing price inflation and housing cost burdens. There's just a volume of literature all over the country for many years that has shown that zoning is a contributing factor in causing housing price inflation and contributing to housing cost burdens. It is also widely known and widely recognized that these burdens fall disproportionately on low-income residents and people of color. And finally, we know that low-density zoning contributes to urban sprawl. It helps exacerbate the amount of vehicle miles traveled and therefore contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. So we know that single-family zoning, low-density zoning is a major contributor to our housing cost problem as well as our climate change problem. So what can be done? So in many places around the country now, people are looking at this quite carefully and doing things about it. Minneapolis now allows duplexes in single family zones. Oregon, by state law, requires local governments to plan for what they call middle income housing, which is largely duplexes and triplexes and other garden apartments and things like that. Not only are some of the regulatory burdens lowered, but there must be explicit plans to accommodate middle housing. Montgomery County, as some of the colleagues on the webinar know, now allows for accessory dwelling units in single family zones. So we've got a ways to go. There's a movement afoot. I would argue, however, that zoning reform in Maryland is going to require state leadership. Unfortunately, we have Brooke online to provide that leadership.
No pressure.
No pressure though.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
That was great. Really appreciate that. A great way to kick things off with where we are now. And now, Seema, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you have some data that you want to share. So I'm going to make you a host so you can share your slides. One sec. Okay. It's all you.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining today. And always good to follow Garrett, who gives good overview of where we are. I am probably gonna be the one to least talk about zoning and most talk about maybe the impact of redlining, especially in the city of Baltimore. So I wanna basically walk you through a couple of maps and really kind of reflect on maybe what our preconceived notions are about redlining and what its true impact is in the city of ours today. So if you haven't seen the interactive map of Baltimore's redlining, here it is. Here's one example of it. This one is interactive and it's brand new. It's the evictions map in case you want to take a look at it. But you can see where we've had historic redlining areas in the city, you know, back in the 1930s, right? The 1932 insurance rate map. Well, look at what these neighborhoods include today, right? These neighborhoods include Canton, Locust Point, Federal Hill, downtown, Midtown. So there's something, what did redlining really mean to our city? It was a lack of investment, right? It prevented investment from occurring back in the 1930s. And there's kind of a famous quote that the people that moved into these neighborhoods after the 1930s, the devastation had occurred long before they ever arrived. They were just unfortunately in the wake of disinvestment in these neighborhoods. But if you look at Canton, South Baltimore, Federal Hill, downtown today, this is not necessarily our worst neighborhoods. In fact, in some cases, they're actually our best neighborhoods. And so I'm going to show you some data around what that looks like. So if you, all of these links are in that Google Doc for you, but I just wanted to show you what this means with respect to race. This is kind of what we in Baltimore, coined by Dr. Lawrence Brown, is considered the white L. This is where we have a predominantly white area, but I will say in the middle of the city, it's very much a mix. But up here and down here, there's predominantly white. And unfortunately, we have what Dr. Brown has coined the black butterfly. And so in this center area, which is areas that were redlined in the past, we actually have a mix of different kinds of neighborhoods. So that's a little bit about demographics, but let's look at what's happened today in some of these neighborhoods that were in the redlined areas in the past. So this is the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators website. It's all interactive. I've gone straight to the interactivity that I wanted to show you, but hopefully all of you will fool around and play with whichever neighborhoods you want to take a look at. But you can see Baltimore City has a moderate increase in, you know, pretty gradual increase in median income. Unfortunately, downtown Winchester that had been redlined is, you know, less than half the median income today. And we have neighborhoods like South Baltimore, which includes Locust Point and Canton, that are not only higher than the citywide average, but look at this rate of increase in median income in just the last 10 years, since 2010. This is actually the most dramatic rate of income increase in the city in what was historically redlined neighborhoods. So what does that tell us? That tells us that we as a city actually know how to overcome redlining, right? We actually know how to overcome redlining. We have neighborhoods where the devastation of the past, unfortunately, and what have we done in these neighborhoods? If we take a look at these neighborhoods, the biggest thing that you can see for our city since the 1930s, what are the biggest investments that we have made that have impacted neighborhoods? Well, clearly our highway system, right? I-83 coming down in here, which goes right into that middle of those redlined areas, was completed mostly in the 60s, but then also kind of fully completed in the 80s. All of this area here in I-95 was completed in the 60s and the 70s. And then more recently, look at what's happened in Canton and Fells Point. the Boston Street redevelopment and the President Street that comes right along these areas were all completed in the early 2000s, very recently. And down here in the south part, the Key Highway reconstruction was completed in kind of 2009, 2010. And what does that kind of tell us? When we have those kind of strategic investments, what do we get? We get all of the other kind of development that we want, all of the kind of development that has occurred in Canton and Fells Point since the last 20 years. 20 years ago, I would have not been able to tell you convincingly that Canton was going to be our #1 median income neighborhood in the city of Baltimore. And that's where we are today. So really, if we see that investing to overcome disinvestment is kind of the remedy to redlining, we actually literally have examples of that. So let's take a look now at our capital investment plan for the city of Baltimore. And this is our current CIP as put out by our own city planning department. And unfortunately, we are not undoing the disinvestment of the past. We still have areas here in the West that were redlined in the past that are still not catching up to the level of investment that is occurring in kind of some other parts of our neighborhood. So these are the kinds of maybe slightly boring things that we actually need to let neighborhoods know to track, right? We have to actually track where the city is investing capital investment, because we can see that when the city invests, it will lead to so much other development and undo the disinvestment that happened in the past. Just in terms of zoning, just to kind of make sure that I touch on that point, one of the things that you'll see and so critical transit and transportation improvements are to our neighborhoods, look at the workarounds that developers have gone to in the city of Baltimore when we had our old zoning code that was very antiquated and then was just updated in 2017. Look at all of the planned unit developments all along I-83 to basically kind of work around the old zoning. And then all along the water here. These are all ways to get around what the zoning was and make a more modern ability to build. And we use the planned unit development process in the city of Baltimore probably more than any other jurisdiction in the state of Maryland. But it is all tied to other capital improvements that our city does so that developers want to then develop and make the kinds of investments that lead to better neighborhoods. So that's my quick story of the relationship between redlining, investment, and how you get development.
This is great, fascinating. Thank you for that. Wow. Very good use of maps. Thank you.
That's my day job.
No, that's great. It would have taken me hours to find each of those links. So thank you. That was great. And now I'm going to turn it over to Willow to talk a little bit about her work and what she's seen in this area and trends. So Willow, happy to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you for having me. And as expected, my colleagues did a fabulous job sort of laying the groundwork for thinking about lots of data with regard to zoning and disparities and the legacy that we live with today from redlining. But I wanted to take a little bit of a step back and sort of think about fundamental concepts that can shape our discussion about land use and race. Because I think this discussion should and will go beyond redlining, because we've had a number of tools over the centuries that have really tied race, land use, and disparities together. And I think it's important to sort of lay that groundwork as well for our discussion. So I would just start by saying that fundamentally in the US, property and land use are racialized concepts, meaning that they're based in the disparity of racial disparities and exploitation, right? Back to chattel slavery, back to the stealing of indigenous lands, back to the Homestead Act and the redistribution of land according to race and gender, and the ways in which this manifests in both historic land use practices, historic public policies, and historic institutions, as well as contemporary institutions. And that I hope that our discussion today is not just centering on redlining, but is centering on those myriad types of ways in which race has been baked into our systems of property valuation, land use evaluation, and banking and real estate industries. And so we can talk about Baltimore as the first racially zoned city in the United States, and the very idea of land use as being one to separate incompatible uses, which were fundamentally not only about noxious uses and the separation of buildings and building types, but was fundamentally about the separation of people as well. And the idea of race mixing being fundamentally conceived as incompatible uses, right? And so the very tool of zoning that we're talking about today was fundamentally conceived in that light. But we also, while we have redlining, we also have racial covenants and deed restrictions. We have practices of blockbusting and racial steering. We have the violence and intimidation that went along with attempts of African Americans and others to move into white neighborhoods. And this was not only just violence and intimidation by individuals, but by homeowners associations, by police officers, by institutions of the state, right? So these policies and these practices move from the federal level, as they did in redlining, down to the local level into private institutions from public policy as well. We have slum clearance policies that, and the targeted disinvestment and the targeted removal of African-American communities out of prime downtown land, which happened not only in Baltimore, but other places around the country as well. We have concentrated public housing that oftentimes when communities were removed, whether by policies of slum clearance or by federal highway policies that targeted African-American communities for areas where highways were supposed to go, then contained and enclosed those communities in areas that then allowed them to be targeted for disinvestment, underinvestment, and predatory practices of housing, right? So while African-Americans paid more for housing to live in areas that were actually, where the housing quality was worse, where they paid, they overpaid for overcrowded housing, and were host to a multiple number of predatory practices around housing because of the segregated housing market that they lived in today. And then, or they lived in the past, but then we say, well, then we passed the Fair Housing Act, so shouldn't all this now be done? Well, first of all, redlining worked on top of all those other practices, right? And so redlining was a fundamental way of tying risk and race together, right? And while we undid that, the legal mechanisms of that tying, we have not undone the ways in which it continues to play out in our assessments and in the ways in which we think about the notions of property and race is tied together, right? So first of all, we never really enacted or enforced the Fair Housing Act, so we don't really have a functional Fair Housing Act in the United States. We're 50 years past the Fair Housing Act, and we're still fighting over this notion of quote unquote affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is a fundamental concept of that act, which is about communities actively enforcing the act, and we don't have that active enforcement happening today. And we continue to have structures put in place that tie this notion of risk, race, and exclusion, or predatory inclusion, right? So Brooke, if I were to recommend a next book to you, it would be Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's Race for Profit, which sort of follows up on the idea of, we had redlining. Well, why didn't we have sort of inclusion of African Americans into home ownership directly after that? Well, we did. We just had it on predatory terms, right? And so even the contemporary subprime lending crisis is the most recent manifestation of that notion of predatory inclusion, right? And that, of course, hitting Black homeowners the hardest, and importantly, Black homeowners in suburbs, right? And so areas where African Americans were denied the opportunity to live all of a sudden became the sort of zones of predatory inclusion in sort of the post-redlining era. But we also have what Garrett talked about, exclusionary zoning, these large lots of single family zoning. We have design guidelines and covenants, codes, and restrictions, historic preservation guidelines. We have fundamentally sort of a lack of regional planning and regional governments that allows fragmented municipalities to adopt their own exclusive land use policies and hoard their wealth in very contained areas, and we don't have a sort of regional governance structure in order to undo that or require municipalities to take their quote unquote fair share of affordable housing or other types of land use practices that might be valuable. This allows areas to be easily targeted for environmental injustice, and we continue to see, you know, Seema talked about, you know, the ways in which, you know, areas that are redlined, well, what we have to do is then invest in those areas. But what we also know is that our land use policies that are investing in historically redlined areas are also some of the areas that are now gentrifying, right? And so we don't have a host of anti-displacement and inclusionary land use practices that allow Black communities and other communities of color that have historically been disenfranchised and disinvested to allow them to stay in those communities in the same way. And so on almost every indicator of opportunity, the communities that were redlined in the past have either seen this historic and ongoing and circular disinvestment, so lack of home ownership, lack of health, lack of quality health care, lack of business and entrepreneurship opportunities, lack of school funding, all these other indicators, all those layers of the maps that Seema provides. We see that, or we see the opposite of that, right? Which is that we're using our land use policies to reinvest in those communities, but not in the ways that's about allowing those communities to access the opportunities, but it's about allowing new communities to access a host of opportunities, and that way re-entrenching the disparities that we see. And the last thing I'll say in wrapping up is that this landscape of segregated metropolitan fragmentation doesn't actually do us any good. And I think we tend to think that if we live in an advantage, a high income white enclave in the suburbs, that we're getting something from it. But if the Black Lives Matter and the protests on the street aren't telling us anything, it should be telling us that this is, first of all, then it's not just about police violence, but it's about the fundamental disparities that we're seeing in our social and our political system, and that it's not actually doing us any good. The Chicago Metropolitan Council did a study that assessed what the city of Chicago would get if they reduced their segregation levels down to the national average. Not did away with segregation altogether, but just to the national average, which is pretty high actually. And what they calculated is that they would see $4.4 billion in additional annual revenue. They would have homicide rate drop by 30% across the metropolitan area, and they would see 83,000 more people with bachelor's degrees, right? And so it's this notion that we're getting something from this when we're actually all losing, and we actually do know how to undo this. And so I hope that we spend a lot of time talking about how to undo it. But I think, first of all, we have to have the political will and folks like Brooke to lead this conversation in order to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That was exceptional. I really appreciate you taking the time to educate many of us, including me, on a lot of this. And there's lots more to learn, but I do appreciate that. I especially, I certainly appreciate your last point. I used to work for a man named Paul Wellstone, and he always said, we all do better when we all do better, right? It's like there are no walls between our neighborhoods. We are all in this together. And so we have to make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind and we're actually being together. So thank you. Now I'm thrilled to turn it over to Dan Reed, who's done a lot of thinking and working in this area and advocating for policies, like you mentioned, Willow, that can help change the future and our trajectory. So Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you to sorry, it's a tough act to follow, but I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Delegate Learman, and thanks to everyone who spoke today, and thanks to everyone who's here. This is a really important conversation, and I'm glad that you created this space where we could talk about it. Can I share some slides?
Yeah, sure. I'll make you the host. Give me one sec. Let's see. Where are you?
All right. Share.
Why don't I see you? Oh, okay. Sorry. Wait, I don't know if I've been given the host. If I'm Seema, can you make me the host again, or can you make Dan? We'll pass it along.
What a time to be alive.
Yeah, I know.
Oh my God, I'm so
There you
powerful.
go.
I didn't know.
Yeah, I know. You could have done so much. Yeah. Go ahead, Dan. Thanks.
Can everybody see my slides?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so first, normally when I talk, I ask for a show of hands. Who here seen or heard of the show The Wonder Years? I only see a few faces, so I'm just going to assume once you raise your hands. For those who haven't seen it, The Wonder Years was a sitcom on ABC in the 80s and 90s. It told the story of a family growing up in the 1960s after RFK's assassination. It is set in no real place in particular, but is loosely based on the creators' hometowns. Neil Martins grew up in Huntington, Long Island, New York. Carol Black grew up in Silver Spring in Maryland. So I like to think of this show as a document in some ways of what it was like to live in Montgomery County and in Maryland in the 1960s, which is to say it was very nice on the show if you were white. But for, I can't advance my slide. Hold on a second. Can I do that? No, oh my gosh. There we go. These communities were heavily segregated from the start. We talked about this today. And we established
Dan, it didn't
this.
advance for the rest of us if you advanced
It did
it.
not. How about now?
You may want to go back and reshare again.
Okay, my apologies.
Happened to me before.
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. I haven't thought of The Wonder Years in a really long time.
Yeah, did it work?
Yep,
Yep.
that worked.
Awesome. Okay, so as we've all discussed so far, a lot of these new suburban communities were not open to everybody, whether it was because the shopping centers were segregated and that people of color couldn't access them, or racial covenants. When you'd buy a home, there'd be language saying you couldn't sell your home to a Black person or a Jewish person or a Middle Eastern person. And in the more bougier neighborhoods of Montgomery County, you couldn't sell your home to a Catholic or Eastern European person. And advertisements from this period were very explicit. Like they would use language like covenants or restricted to say or the right kinds of neighbors will live here. And some places were very clear, like this community is for you if you want to discriminate. And we talked a little bit about redlining maps and how communities all over the country were graded to basically distinguish how valuable they were perceived and how eligible they should be for public investments or for government-backed loans. We saw what that map looked like in Baltimore, in Montgomery County, and the Washington, D.C. area. Those were generally communities west of Rock Creek Park, places like Bethesda and Chevy Chase and Kensington, or even the Woodside Park neighborhood in Silver Spring. We have increasingly in the past few years a grounding in this history. I think we don't always talk about how that continues to manifest itself today. We live in an environment, whether in the city or the suburbs, that the combination of covenants and redlining and zoning that distinguishes areas where we can put only single family homes or only apartments or only shopping centers into communities that are, to this day bifurcated by price range of the homes in that community, which means the certain income levels that can live in those communities, which in turn often means racially segregated communities, because the people who had access to purchase homes 60, 70, and 80 years ago and had access to build wealth at that time were able to amass wealth, pass it on to future generations who could amass more wealth and pass it on, effectively blocking out even Black or brown people who have large incomes from accessing, these communities. And that sort of is the foundation of the inequalities we see today. And the result, in a lot of these suburban communities is they were built for middle-class white people, and everyone who doesn't fit into that, if you're Black, if you're queer, if you're a single parent, if you are a non-nuclear family, or if you particularly don't have access to a car, you're kind of stuck. And the irony is, as a lot of us cherish the diversity and integration in the communities where they do exist, right? We talk about, we love local music scenes, we love immigrant-owned businesses, we love having friends and colleagues from all different backgrounds, we love the confusing or weird things that can happen when you live in a diverse place. All of those things really just exist in the margins of a policy structure and a built environment that was built explicitly to give middle-class and affluent white families the access to build and amass wealth. The result is, in the Baltimore region, in the DC region, and in much of the country, you can build, this guy here, a single family house almost literally everywhere. And everything else gets forced into this Byzantine zoning and policy regime designed to make them really hard to build, because we didn't want those things in the first place. And it's no surprise that people work very hard to preserve this status quo. We don't always think about them as upholding these racist and classist structures, but in their desire to protect their own quality of life, that's effectively what happens. I talk a lot with my neighbors and friends in Montgomery County about the language we use around change. Sometimes people are very explicit when they go to the county council or city council or planning board and they say, we don't want you to impose a leftist political agenda on us. We're worried about changing demographics, or everyone's favorite dog whistle. We don't want to look like PG County, or we don't want to look like Baltimore, or we don't want to look like X neighborhood. But we also should keep an eye out for other kinds of language that people use. We believe this community is suburban. We don't want it to become urban. There are places even in the city limits of Baltimore where people use that kind of language to talk about what they do or don't want in their community. We should look at people who sometimes co-opt the language of social justice to shape an environment around them that privileges and centers white people. For instance, these two women held a protest in Tacoma Park 2 years ago holding up signs that say, "We can't breathe." Were they talking about the murder of Eric Garner by a New York City police officer? Absolutely not. They were part of a group of people who have been fighting for several years the construction of a shopping center and affordable housing on a city-owned parking lot. And they've been largely successful in blocking that project. Sometimes people use the language of the environment. The town of Chevy Chase spending decades and tens if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight the purple line because of concerns about a small shrimp-like creature that nobody could actually find. And the reason I bring all this up is because what we often characterize as debates about land use or debates about transportation are really just opportunities for people to entrench a status quo and using different kinds of language to do so. And the result for the people who are not included in that debate, the people who don't necessarily live or have access to an affluent or privileged community, is a game of musical chairs in which everybody else is sort of left figuring out where they fit. For instance, here is that redlining map again, zooming in on the part of Montgomery County and Washington, DC. And you can see these areas on the left were the areas that were rated very highly in the 1930s, and these areas on the right were rated rather low. Speed up to today, this is a map of commute times in Montgomery County. The lighter colored areas have shorter commutes, which means they are closer to jobs. The darker colored areas have longer commutes. They're farther from jobs. If you look at home values, the areas that have these lighter yellow colors are the areas that rebounded the most after the Great Recession and were able to preserve or even grow their wealth and equity. These areas on the right that were either in or adjacent to historically redlined communities are the communities that have actually lost home values since the Great Recession. These are communities where traditionally Black and brown people have been able to live in Montgomery County, and they have lost wealth because of the Great Recession. And these are also communities that, because race and class are so intertwined, have the highest number of students on free and reduced lunch in schools. And if you go on the western side of the county, the areas that were historically graded the highest by government maps 80 years ago, these communities are basically protected and exclusive enclaves, even in the public schools, for white and sometimes Asian middle and upper middle class families. And this becomes a cycle that continues to perpetuate itself. I put these two little sticky notes here to represent two different high schools in Montgomery County, in which the catchments of each of these schools, a local builder built these two identical homes in 1985. They are, and I cannot make this clear enough, identical. They are 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom houses, 2-car garage, quarter-acre lot, 2,500 square feet. In 1985, both of these homes sold for $200,000 each, the exact same house. The difference, they were on two different sides of this divide in Montgomery County. And today, this house on the left, which is zoned for a majority-minority high school, that's 80% non-white students, sold for $515,000. This house on the right, which is in a majority white and Asian school and one of the higher ranked schools in the county, is worth $765,000. Now, these are both ridiculous and astronomical sums of money, but it demonstrates how even after all of the things that we thought were segregating our communities have disappeared, that legacy is so hard to shake. And what we're increasingly seeing is even in the suburbs, even in the communities that were built to protect access to wealth for white people, we're seeing these cycles of disinvestment begin all over again. This is a house a mile from the house I grew up in that the owners lost their home during the Great Recession, and the house was basically abandoned. This home was only 30 years old. And to be honest, I'm not sure if it looks all that different today. And you see that in the commercial centers. This is a shopping center built in 1989. Wealth and affluence and white flight have basically sucked all the investment out of this community, and it is all but abandoned today. And these are the communities where people who these places were not built for now struggle to figure out, how do I access good education? How do I access shopping? How do I access, jobs and all the daily needs of my life in this place that was not designed for me to access these things? And, these are the questions that we're going to have to face all over Maryland, in Baltimore, in the DC area, in the rural parts of the state even, as we move forward. And we're not going to move forward as a state unless we figure out what to do about it. So that's my piece.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Do you want to make me the host again? You just click on the 3 little dots on my picture and put make host. If you go to my picture. So this was really a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate all the presentations. There were a lot of really great questions, and we're not going to get to all of them because it's already 5:50, but we will. I want to throw out a few questions that folks had, and then I saw a couple in the chat as well. Your maps reminded me, Dan, I grew up on 16th Street before we moved to Montgomery County, and when my parents bought the house, it was considered the wrong side of the park. Which is sort of amazing because those houses are worth a fortune now, but it was a very integrated neighborhood where I grew up, and but it was considered weird for a white family to buy there, according to many decades ago. So it's really interesting how these things stay with us. So there are a couple of questions that I'd love to, and whoever wants to pipe in would love to have your thoughts. So there are a couple, are there current urban planning policies we should reconsider because they're founded in a racially divisive past? Is it, then there was another question that I thought was interesting about what kind of investment makes a difference for these, for neighborhoods? Is it, somebody asked, do we need to, can we put performing arts centers? Should we be putting, and I think Seema, you talked a little bit about the need for transit and infrastructure needs. So sort of what are some of the investments that we can make now, and what urban planning policies should we be reconsidering because they are founded in a racially divisive past and are perhaps not helping us move away from that? Any thoughts on either of those to start off with? From anyone? Keep yourselves.
Go ahead, Dan.
One thing that I've been thinking about, and I want to make it clear that I don't think this is always an exclusively racist policy, is that how we use and implement historic preservation can often be a tool to make communities more exclusive. in part because when you apply it over a really broad area, you know, it comes with restrictions on what you can do to your home and the certain kind of materials that you can use. These things are really expensive, and it adds a lot of burden to people to maintain their homes, and they may not be able to. So it's not that I think we shouldn't have historic districts, but I do think we need to be a little more reflective about why they were established, what we want to include within a historic district, and what burdens it may place on residents that make it unaffordable for them to live there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
I did want to, you know, pick up on what Willow had said, that whenever we invest, we know exactly right now where 6 years worth of investment is going at the local level, at the state level, and in some cases, if we're lucky, at the federal level. That investment will drive all kinds of other opportunities. And to what Willow is saying, if you don't protect the people that are there right now, you're just going to create a situation where you have displaced people. And so Canton is actually a great example. 20 years ago, nobody would have said that that would be our highest income and highest kind of median sales price neighborhood. But 20 years ago is when we had the opportunity to actually protect affordable housing back then. And so Canton now has absolutely no affordable housing.
Yep.
It's like 4 out of 1,000 rental properties are subsidized.
Yeah.
But we had a shot 20 years ago when we knew that the Boston Street corridor was going to get reconstructed to actually make that an intentional policy. And so I would definitely be looking forward to us all, at least in Baltimore City that I have better knowledge about, being extremely intentional about looking for continued ways to make sure our investments lead to diversity and not to kind of high-end gentrification.
And that's an interesting point. I think, you know, in Montgomery County, they have always, or they're one of the first areas in the country to have an inclusionary zoning policy that has yielded, you know, if imperfect, you know, important results in terms of scattered sites and, you know, affordable housing sort of all over the county. And we have not done that in Baltimore City, right? We do not have mandatory affordable inclusionary housing policies. And our inclusionary housing policy that does exist on the books requires the city to pay for any units that's developed. So it ends up being, you know, I think it's been used once at Harbor Point, maybe. So it's a real problem. So thanks for bringing that up. Willow, I think you were going to say something. Sorry.
So I would just say that I think it's safe to say that most of our planning tools were actually built in an era of racial, are actually can be used for racially disparate ends, right? Through racially disparate processes.
Right.
So to me, it's not a question of which ones are and which ones aren't based in a racist past. They're all based in a racist past and a racist present, right? So the tool, the key to me is to understand how racism plays out in our plans and through our policies and through our means of adopting those policies and adopting more redistributive and reparative justice and racial justice frameworks in order to use those tools for more equitable and just ends. And so I think we shouldn't be doing the slicing and dicing about which policies lead to, because historic preservation can be used for good, not for evil, right? It just so happens that it's often used as a NIMBY tool to prevent neighborhoods from changing in ways that powerful, oftentimes high income and white homeowners don't want to see change. But it can also be used to protect neighborhoods that actually, when we're talking about anti-displacement measures, that they can be used in that way too, right? And so I think it's sort of the ways in which we think about what tools are designed and what processes and ends we get to, and we have to do that through a lens of assuming that all of our tools are racist.
Yep.
Well,
thank you for that.
I guess I would be a little more optimistic than that. I think that in some places, you know, Oregon, for example, has adopted some policies that can move things in the right direction. I think the state has the opportunity to do things like that. put in a plug for our own work in the Purple Line corridor, where we think, and I see George is on the line too, that we are making some substantial investments in affordable housing and are very cultural sensitive to what we're doing. I'm intrigued by Barbara Samuel's question here about how Maryland's smart growth scheme has become, the PFAs have become a tool of, I mean, this speaks to Willow's point, I guess, is that has this tool, which we all lauded, back in the 70s, or sorry, back in 1997, as a great environmental tool, has that become an instrument of exclusion? I think that's a very fascinating question.
Yeah. And then the next question talks a little bit about single family housing. Is banning single family housing zoning in Maryland a feasible and effective piece of a larger plan for addressing inequity in the state? I mean, I would take that further and say, like, what are the range? What's sort of the menu of options? In Montgomery County, there was the ADU. You mentioned in Minneapolis, it was the duplex. Like, what are some of our type tools like that could help moving forward?
I think there are some tools that we can design. I think banning single family zoning is sort of the wrong messaging. I think, that agenda will not have political legs. But if we use sort of the Maryland approach of identifying places near transit, in high opportunity areas, the state loves to carve out zones and say, here's where affordable housing needs to go, and here's where, breakdowns in single family restrictions could go. I do think there's an opportunity there. We have these community legacy designated areas. I think we can do some work with the language there. I think we can do some work on the language of the housing elements, right? You're not going to eliminate this with some tinkering at the margin. On the other hand, if you don't tinker at the margin, you're not going to make any progress. So I look forward to working with you, Brooke, figure out how we do move this agenda.
Thanks.
And I don't think by banning single family zoning, I get the point, and I support it, but that's just the wrong messaging.
But even where this is occurring, right, Minneapolis is a totally different housing market than Baltimore, for example. Maybe it's more similar to Prince George's County. But to your point, if we don't invest in the things that move people around, the housing is irrelevant because no one's going to come. And we have such a huge circulation problem in our city that if we don't really address that first to get people to be able to circulate, we're just atrophying some of our neighborhoods. Yep,
absolutely. City and region. I mean, I think it's enormously frustrating how small our state is and how difficult it is to get around it if you don't have a car. And certainly that goes to zoning. Sometimes when I'm on the mark and I stop at some of the stations and there's a surface parking lot, I just am like, oh my gosh, it's frustrating. Well, this is great. I want to quickly recognize that we do have a number of elected officials on the call today. We have Delegate Kathy Forbes, Delegate Lisa Bell Castro, Delegate Jen Terrassa, and former council member George Leventhal. So thanks for joining us. And then, we are at 6, unbelievably. That was very quick. So maybe if you have any sort of final comments, we'll just wrap up. But really grateful for all of you for taking the time today. So maybe, 1 or 2 quick points. Let's start. Why don't we go in reverse order? Dan, you want to start us off?
Closing statements or?
Yeah, just closing your closing argument. No. Yeah, just closing statement.
I don't want to undersell the power of zoning into improving outcomes. I mean, we want to have integrated communities. We want to give people access to amenities and stuff. And I think, the more I learn about the rhetoric that we use to sell these kind of neighborhoods to people who intentionally wanted to segregate themselves, like, the more I'm like, these are the Confederate moderate monuments that just sit all around us. And like, if we can take it down, let's go, So that's my 2 cents.
I like, it's a good analogy. Yep. Thank you. Willow?
I would say that redlining has had a very significant impact on contemporary understandings and contemporary wealth building, but we can't underestimate the ways that we continue to reinvest in these systems.
Well said. Thank you. Seema?
I just wanted to thank you and thank my fellow panelists. It was so great to be on with you today. But I will say that in the city of Baltimore, redlining has a huge legacy, but I would say blockbusting had a worse legacy if you look at where those maps are and what that's done and the level of investment that we've done in neighborhoods that were redlined in the past. So small plug, watch your CIP in all of your jurisdictions and look at where the massive capital investments are going and participate, because that's really where the future of your jurisdiction is going to go.
Yep. I should give a shout out to Not My Neighborhood by Antero Piatella too, which I read years ago and recently went to pull out again to brush up. So thank you. Garrett?
Yeah, so I also want to thank you. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank my panelists. Thank everyone for joining us. But do want to end up on an optimistic note that with enough commitment to policy change, the state has made slow progress, but we're not at the end of our progress. And so now that there is a movement afoot, now that there is momentum, let's take that momentum and get to the next level of smart growth in the state.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us today. You know, this is an ongoing conversation. I certainly hope as the Land Use Committee Chair to pull these folks and others together to do briefings for our committee to talk about the policies that we need to do, that we need to undo, and some policies that we need to implement to make sure that the state does do better. And, you know, Willow, I think the points that you made about how this isn't helping anybody are really important for us to keep in mind. When folks get nervous about changing some of these policies, we have to remember that it doesn't have to be this way. It can be a lot better, and we have the power to do that. So thank you so much to all of you for joining today. Keep in touch, be well. I'm grateful for all you do. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.